December 11, 2008. FBI agents arrived at a Manhattan penthouse on the Upper East Side. Bernard Madoff opened the door. When confronted about allegations of fraud, he said there was no innocent explanation. Within hours, the largest Ponzi scheme in history collapsed, revealing losses estimated at $65 billion. Bernard Lawrence Madoff was born April 29, 1938, in Queens, New York. His father, Ralph, worked as a plumber, the child of Polish immigrants. His mother, Sylvia, was a housewife, daughter of Romanian and Austrian immigrants. After briefly attending the University of Alabama, Madoff earned a degree in political science from Hofstra University in 1960. That same year, using $5,000 he saved from working as a lifeguard and installing sprinkler systems, he founded Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities with his wife, Ruth. The firm started legitimately as a penny stock brokerage. Madoff developed computerized trading software with his brother Peter that was eventually adopted by NASDAQ. The technology laid foundations for electronic trading systems used today. By 2008, the firm ranked as the sixth largest market maker in S&P 500 stocks. Madoff served as NASDAQ chairman in 1990 and 1991 and 1993. But Madoff operated a secret side business. In 1960, he opened an investment advisory unit where clients gave him money to invest on their behalf. According to FBI Supervisory Special Agent Paul Roberts, Madoff made a bad trade early on and lost significant money for his father-in-law's friends. He started covering losses with fake trades. Each lie required another lie. The Ponzi scheme began. The mechanics were frighteningly simple. Madoff promised unusually consistent returns around 10% annually. When investors handed over money, he deposited it into his personal bank account at Chase Manhattan Bank. He paid returns to earlier investors using money from later investors. Client trading statements showing profits were complete fabrications. According to court documents, Madoff admitted the scheme began in the early 1990s, though an ex-trader testified to faking records since the early 1970s. Madoff's strategy appeared sophisticated. He claimed to use a split-strike conversion approach focusing on shares in the Standard & Poor's 100 stock index. One Madoff fund reported 10.5% annual returns over 17 years. Even at the end of November 2008, during a general market collapse, the same fund reported it was up 5.6%, while the S&P 500 had a negative 38% year-to-date return. The scheme grew through feeder funds. These independent hedge funds aggregated capital from smaller investors and institutions, funneling hundreds of millions directly into Madoff's firm. Funds like Fairfield Century and King 8 Global Management performed minimal due diligence and served as insulation between Madoff and the ultimate victims. Fairfield Greenwich Group was the largest feeder fund investing with Madoff, sending billions of clients' dollars his way. The feeder funds were paid substantial management and performance fees based on fictitious profits reported by Madoff's firm. With basically no costs versus their fees, the feeder funds could pay large rebates to fund distributors and private banks. Madoff's firm did not charge fees, instead making money on trading commissions. Financial analyst Harry Markopolos discovered the fraud in 1999. Working at a Boston firm, he was asked to replicate Madoff's strategy to compete for clients. When Markopolos examined Madoff's revenue stream, he spotted immediate problems. The biggest red flag was that returns rose steadily, with only a few downticks represented graphically by a nearly perfect 45-degree angle. Markopolos testified before Congress that this would be like a baseball player batting 966 for the season compared to 300 to 400 for elite players. In November 2005, Markopolos sent a 21-page memo to SEC regulators titled, "The World's Largest Hedge Fund is a Fraud." The document outlined 30 red flags based on more than 14 years of Madoff return numbers. During that period, Madoff reported only 4 losing months. Markopolos stated in the memo that Bernie Madoff was running the world's largest unregistered hedge fund, organized as a hedge fund of funds. Markopolos later testified to Congress that to deliver 12% annual returns to investors, Madoff needed to earn an extraordinary 16% gross on a regular basis to distribute a 4% fee to feeder fund managers. Between 2000 and 2008, Markopoulos submitted evidence to the SEC 5 times. The agency never conducted a proper Ponzi scheme examination of Madoff. According to the SEC Inspector General's report, enforcement investigators felt Markopoulos was not an insider and immediately discounted his complaint. When asked what else Markopoulos could have provided, investigators said perhaps only a recording of Madoff admitting he was running a Ponzi scheme. The SEC conducted multiple investigations into Madoff's business practices, but failed to detect the fraud. In 2003, Madoff told the Inspector General he was certain he would be caught. He said it was Accounting 101 to check with the Depository Trust Commission to discover a Ponzi scheme. When SEC investigators provided evasive or contradictory answers to important questions during testimony, they accepted his explanations as plausible. The SEC never made a single phone call to confirm that shares Madoff claimed he bought actually existed. According to FBI case agent Keith Kelly, Madoff and his right-hand man, Frank DiPascali, once found SEC briefcases left overnight in a Madoff conference room. They opened the briefcases and read the questions they would be asked the next day and printed new documents to satisfy the questions, then cooled the documents in a refrigerator so they would not be warm from the printer. Financial crimes like the Madoff scheme exploit trust and complexity at multiple levels. Investors often lack the expertise to verify sophisticated investment strategies independently. This creates vulnerability that skilled fraudsters systematically manipulate. Professional oversight becomes critical in protecting assets from these types of schemes. Financial consultants who specialize in risk assessment and fraud detection provide an essential safeguard that many investors overlook until it is too late. Services like those offered at equilibriumconsultants.com help clients identify red flags in investment opportunities before committing funds. Independent review of financial statements and verification of trading activity and analysis of return patterns can prevent catastrophic losses. When investment opportunities seem too consistent or too exclusive or too secretive, professional scrutiny is not optional. The Madoff case demonstrates that even sophisticated investors need independent verification. Working with qualified financial crime consultants who understand the warning signs can be the difference between preserving wealth and losing everything. Madoff cultivated an air of exclusivity. Not everyone was accepted into his funds. It became a mark of prestige to be admitted as a Madoff investor. He targeted wealthy and influential businessmen in New York City and Palm Beach, Florida. He signed them as investors and paid handsome returns and used their recommendations to attract more money. Most Ponzi schemes appeal to greed and promise returns of 20% or higher. Madoff appealed to investors' fear of volatility with consistent 10% returns. The victims spanned across economic classes and geographic boundaries. Over 16,521 investors filed claims against Madoff. The scheme began in the early 1970s, and by the time of Madoff's arrest in December 2008, had defrauded as many as 37,000 people in 136 countries. Many accounts of Madoff's crimes incorrectly assume the majority of victims were large institutions and high net worth individuals. Most victims helped by the Madoff Victim Fund were actually small investors, with losses averaging roughly $250,000. Celebrity victims made headlines. Actors Kevin Bacon and Kira Sedgwick lost tens of millions of their life savings in the scheme. Holocaust survivor and Nobel Peace Prize winner Elie Wiesel lost his life savings of $12 million along with $15 million from the Elie Wiesel Foundation for Humanity. Wiesel described Madoff as one of the greatest scoundrels and thieves and liars and criminals. When asked if he could forgive him, Wiesel said no. He explained that to forgive would mean Madoff would come on his knees and ask for forgiveness, which he would not do. Director Steven Spielberg's Wunderkinder Foundation also took a substantial hit, with Madoff managing around 60% of the charity's dividend and interest income by 2006. The foundation lost around $340,000. DreamWorks animation executive Jeffrey Katzenberg lost $20 million. The Los Angeles Times uncovered this amount, though Katzenberg did not disclose it publicly. He described the loss as painful and humiliating. Actor John Malkovich lost $2 million. Hungarian-American actress Zsa Gabor reportedly lost between $7 and $10 million. Not all victims were even aware they invested with Madoff. Some hedge funds and feeder funds opened accounts with Madoff without telling their clients. Those clients were individuals and charities and companies that created retirement accounts for their staffs. The funding companies had some financial protection through the Securities Investor Protection Corporation, but individual clients did not. They lost everything. By late 2008, Wall Street was collapsing. Firms merged or went bankrupt. The government intervened with bailouts, spending billions of dollars. The stock market dropped daily. At Bernard L. Madoff, investment securities gains were still being recorded with average returns of 1% monthly. Worried investors wanted to withdraw their money. Madoff's Chase account held over $5.5 billion in mid-2008. By late November, it was down to $234 million, a fraction of outstanding redemption requests. With banks having stopped lending, Madoff could not borrow the money needed. On December 3, 2008, he told Frank DiPascali he was finished. On December 9th, he told his brother Peter about the fraud. On December 10th, Madoff suggested to his sons Mark and Andrew that the firm pay out $173 million in bonuses 2 months early. They demanded to know where the money was coming from. That evening, at the Madoff apartment with Ruth Madoff nearby, Bernie told his sons the investment fund was one big lie, basically a giant Ponzi scheme. According to their attorney, the sons then reported their father to federal authorities. The next day, December 11th, FBI agents visited Madoff's home. According to FBI accounts, when agents confronted him, Madoff said there was no innocent explanation. He was arrested and charged with securities fraud. Madoff posted $10 million bail and remained under 24-hour monitoring and house arrest in his Upper East Side penthouse until his guilty plea. On March 12, 2009, Madoff pleaded guilty to 11 federal felonies, including securities fraud and investment advisor fraud and mail fraud and wire fraud, and 3 counts of money laundering and false statements and perjury and false SEC filings and theft from an employee benefit plan. On June 29, 2009, Judge Denny Chin sentenced him to 150 years in prison, the maximum allowed. At his sentencing, Madoff addressed the court and said he could not adequately express how sorry he was for what he had done. He added that he realized his arrest and this day would inevitably come. The scandal involved approximately $64 billion in capital and resulted in more than $18 billion in direct losses. The fraud defrauded thousands across 125 different countries. Several victims committed suicide after realizing the extent of their financial losses. Madoff's son, Mark, committed suicide on December 11, 2010, exactly 2 years after his father's arrest. He was found dead in his Manhattan apartment. His son, Andrew, died of cancer on September 3, 2014, at age 48. Andrew had been diagnosed with a rare form of cancer known as mantle cell lymphoma in 2003. In 2011, his lymphoma returned, and he blamed the relapse on the stress of his father's crimes. To unravel the crimes, the FBI all but moved into Madoff's offices. A team of nearly 15 special agents led the effort along with law enforcement partners and FBI financial analysts. For 3 years, the FBI examined every document in Madoff's office and interviewed hundreds of victims to determine who helped Madoff in the scheme. Dozens of subjects were identified, and 14 were ultimately charged. Several pleaded guilty or cooperated with the government. Peter Madoff, who worked with his brother for more than 40 years and ran daily operations for 20 years, was sentenced to 10 years in prison. He agreed to pay more than $90 million. He did not have to settle claims. He had taken $15.7 million over the life of the fraud. He forfeited all his and his family's assets, including their homes, and more than $10 million in savings. Antes Peter was released from prison on August 13, 2020. Frank DiPascali, the firm's chief operating officer, cooperated with prosecutors in exchange for immunity. Only 5 employees insisted on their innocence, including bookkeeper Annette Bongiorno and 2 computer programmers George Perez and Jerome O'Hara. Their cases went to trial with DiPascali as the lead government witness. The trial ended in guilty verdicts for all 5 employees. Recovery efforts began immediately. Trustee Irving Picard worked to recover funds for victims. Approximately $2.2 billion was collected from the estate of deceased Madoff investor Jeffrey Pickwer. Pickwer was found dead at the bottom of his Palm Beach, Florida swimming pool on October 25, 2009. He was 67 years old. On December 17, 2010, a settlement of $7.2 billion was reached between Picard and Barbara Pickwer, the executor of the Pickwer estate. Another $1.7 billion came from J.P. Morgan Chase Bank as part of a deferred prosecution agreement in January 2014. J.P. Morgan admitted that it and its predecessors failed to report illegal activities on Madoff's part, as required by the Bank Secrecy Act as early as 1994. The bank agreed to forfeit $1.7 billion, the largest forfeiture ever imposed in American financial history. J.P. Morgan also agreed to pay a $350 million fine to the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. The remaining funds were collected through civil forfeiture actions against investor Carl Shapiro and his family, and from civil and criminal forfeiture actions against Bernard Madoff and Peter Madoff and their co-conspirators. The Madoff Victim Fund began compensating victims in 2017. By December 2024, the Justice Department had distributed over $4.3 billion to more than 40,000 victims in nearly 130 countries. In the most recent and final distribution payments went to 23,408 victims across the globe, bringing their total recovery to 93.71% of losses. This represented the culmination of a decade of work identifying thousands of victims around the world and unwinding layers of complex financial transactions. When the Madoff Victim Fund was first created, there was a remarkable lack of knowledge about the true dimensions of the fraud. The losses of direct investors had been carefully studied in bankruptcy proceedings, but the losses of indirect investors had not been analyzed. As it turned out, direct investors represented only about 6% of Madoff's known victims. After publishing the plan of distribution and petition forms, the fund received a wave of more than 65,000 petitions covering over $80 billion in losses. The fund made its first distribution in November 2017. In that first distribution, 21,618 victims were brought to a 25% recovery of their fraud losses from all sources. Roughly 16,500 of those victims, or more than 75%, had zero prior recoveries on their losses. Over the ensuing 7 years, the fund made 9 additional distributions, each of which went to at least 20,000 victims. The victims assisted were overwhelmingly individuals. Over 38,860, or 95%, of the petitioners paid during the process were individuals rather than institutions. The fund did not pay for losses that victims had already recovered from somewhere else or were likely to do so. With finite resources, double payments for some former Madoff investors would correspondingly reduce payments to all others. By bringing each victim to an equal percentage recovered from all sources, the fund prevented some victims from being overpaid and others underpaid. One goal throughout the process was to level out the drastically different recovery percentages among different victims. In each distribution, the fund brought every investor up to a specific level of recovery, but did not pay anyone who had already recovered more than that level. This rising tide structure enabled the fund to eliminate the enormous early differences among victims. Additionally, Irving Picard, the court-appointed trustee, distributed almost $14 billion to former Madoff customers through the bankruptcy liquidation process. Direct investors who invested directly with Madoff's broker were entitled to $500,000 worth of coverage through the Securities Investor Protection Corporation. The trustee analyzed every Madoff account and calculated how much money was invested and how much was withdrawn over the life of that account. This determination of actual loss became the most contentious legal hurdle in the liquidation process. The trustee adopted the net investment method to calculate customer claims, which is the standard procedure in Ponzi scheme liquidations. This method calculated claims based on the actual cash deposited minus any cash withdrawn, excluding fictitious profits that never actually existed. Many investors had believed their accounts held far more value because of the fabricated returns shown on their statements. The realization that decades of supposed gains were entirely fictional devastated many victims who had planned their retirements around those phantom numbers. The litigation targeted massive feeder funds and major banks that facilitated the scheme. Suits against feeder funds alleged they either willfully ignored or were recklessly indifferent to obvious signs of fraud, enabling the scheme to continue. Banks, such as J.P. Morgan Chase, faced lawsuits alleging they failed to report suspicious activity to regulators despite having access to Madoff's accounts. These lawsuits resulted in several landmark settlements that contributed billions of dollars to the customer fund. The trustee secured settlements from numerous parties who had profited from the scheme. The $7.2 billion settlement from the Picower estate represented the largest single recovery. The $550 million settlement with the owners of the Fairfield Century Feeder Fund added substantial funds. The goal of the clawback strategy was to equalize the losses among all victims who suffered a net loss of principal. Some investors who withdrew more money than they initially invested were required to return those excess funds even if they had no knowledge of the fraud. Bernard Madoff died on April 14, 2021 at the Federal Medical Center in Butner, North Carolina. He was 82 years old, serving his 150-year sentence. He had suffered a heart attack in December 2013 and had end-stage renal disease. In February 2020, Madoff asked a judge for compassionate release from prison, claiming terminal kidney failure and a life expectancy of less than 18 months. Federal prosecutors denied the request on March 4, 2020, saying Madoff's crime was unprecedented in scope and magnitude. The Madoff case revealed systemic failures in financial oversight at multiple levels. Between 1992 and 2008, the SEC received information that should have led to quick discovery of the scheme. Over 16 years, the SEC conducted several examinations and investigations, but failed to detect the massive fraud each time. Tasks were assigned to junior staff with insufficient experience in securities markets. Staff failed to ask obvious questions or take simple steps to verify what Madoff told them. In March 2004, SEC lawyer Genevieve Walker Lightfoot raised questions about unusual trading at a Bernie Madoff fund. Walker Lightfoot was told to instead concentrate on an unrelated matter. Her research was requested, but supervisors did not act upon it. Supervisors in some cases actively discouraged further investigation. A culture at the SEC minimized following up on tips, with enforcement investigators immediately discounting complaints that did not come from insiders. Madoff himself later told the Inspector General that he could have been caught in 2003, but that bumbling investigators had acted like a television detective and never asked the right questions. He stated they never even looked at his stock records and that it would have been easy for them to see the fraud if they had checked with the depository trust company. The SEC Inspector General concluded that if any of several simple verification steps had been fully executed, they would have uncovered Madoff's Ponzi scheme years earlier. The scandal significantly damaged investor confidence worldwide and resulted in losses for charitable foundations and businesses and individuals. The Elie Wiesel Foundation for Humanity lost most of its assets. Other foundations lost money earmarked for diabetes research at Harvard Medical School and Parkinson's research at Columbia Medical School. The case demonstrated that reputation and complexity and regulatory failure can enable massive fraud to persist for decades. It showed that consistent returns, regardless of market conditions and secretive strategies, and unregistered investments, and issues with paperwork, and difficulty receiving payments, are critical warning signs investors must recognize and act upon immediately.